January 11th, 1944. 20,000 feet above the frozen fields of central Germany. A B-17 flying fortress named Memphis Dream takes a direct hit from a 30 cannon shell. The shell punches through the fuselage just behind the cockpit, detonating inside the radio compartment. Sergeant William Reeves, the radio operator, is killed instantly. The explosion rips a hole the size of a dining table in the bomber's skin. Flames erupt from the No. 2 engine. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the wing like arterial blood. The pilot, Lieutenant James Hargrove, screams into the intercom for his crew to bail out, but the intercom is dead. Within 90 seconds, Memphis Dream rolls onto her back and plunges into the German countryside at 400 miles per hour. All 10 men aboard are dead before they hit the ground. And somewhere above this carnage, a German pilot calmly banks his Messerschmitt lines up the next bomber in the formation and opens fire again, because there is nobody to stop him. The American escort fighters turned back 40 minutes ago. They ran out of fuel. This was the reality of the Allied bombing campaign over Europe in early 1943. Every single mission was a death sentence dressed in flight gear. And on this particular January morning, 60 bombers would not come home. 600 young men gone, vanished into the mathematics of a problem nobody could solve. But 4,000 miles away in a dusty factory in Southern California, a 38-year-old German immigrant with no college degree was about to do something that every aeronautical engineer in Britain and America said was impossible. His name was Edgar Schmood. He was a draftsman, a man who drew lines on paper for a living. And within 18 months, those lines would become the most lethal fighter aircraft in the history of aerial warfare. A machine that would hunt German pilots to extinction and rewrite the ending of World War II. The numbers he achieved: a fighter that could fly 2,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. A fighter that increased bomber survival rates by 300%. A fighter that would claim nearly 5,000 aerial victories and break the spine of the Luftwaffe forever. But before we get there, you need to understand just how desperate things were. You need to understand why grown men wept at mission briefings and why the average life expectancy of a bomber crew over Germany was 15 missions. You need to understand the killing fields of the sky. The year was 1943, and the United States Army Air Forces had a theory. A beautiful, elegant, mathematically perfect theory. They believed that large formations of heavy bombers, bristling with defensive guns, could fly deep into enemy territory in broad daylight, destroy strategic targets, and fly home without fighter escort. The theory looked magnificent on chalkboards in Washington. It was catastrophic in practice. The problem was simple but lethal. A B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13.50 caliber machine guns, manned by dedicated gunners, covering every angle of approach. On paper, a formation of 300 bombers created an overlapping field of fire that no fighter could penetrate. The generals called it the combat box. They said it was impenetrable. The German pilots called it something else. They called it a turkey shoot. Because German fighter pilots were not theoretical constructs on a chalkboard. They were combat veterans with thousands of hours of experience. And they had discovered something the American generals refused to accept. A fighter, attacking head-on at a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour, was exposed to defensive fire for exactly 2.5 seconds. In those 2.5 seconds, a B-17 gunner had to identify the target, swing his weapon, lid the target, and fire accurately. Almost none of them could.
But the German pilot, diving through the formation with 4 cannons blazing, could pour 200 rounds into a bomber in that same window. The mathematics were murderous. The first major test came on August 17th, 1943. 376 B-17s took off from English bases to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg. It was the deepest penetration into German airspace yet attempted. The escort fighters P-47 Thunderbolts accompanied the bombers as far as Aachen on the German border. Then they turned back. They had to. Their fuel tanks were nearly empty. The Thunderbolt was a magnificent fighter, 7 tons of American engineering that could dive faster than anything in the sky. But it drank fuel like a man dying of thirst. Its combat radius was barely 300 miles. Berlin was 750 miles from England. The math simply did not work. The moment those P-47s turned for home, the slaughter began.
German fighters fell on the unescorted bombers like wolves on sheep. They attacked in waves. First, the twin-engine Bf-110S firing rockets from beyond machine gun range. Then, the single-engine 109S and 190S, slashing through the formations in pairs. The sky became an abattoir. Bombers exploded, broke apart, spiraled down, trailing smoke and flame. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the blue sky, dozens of them, then hundreds. When the surviving bombers limped back to England that evening, 60 were missing. 600 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. Another 100 bombers were so badly damaged they would never fly again. The 8th Air Force had effectively lost a quarter of its striking power in one mission, and they had barely scratched the targets. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th was even worse. 291 bombers went in. 60 did not come back. Another 17 crashed on landing. 121 more were damaged. The 8th Air Force called it Black Thursday. Privately, commanders knew the truth. The daylight bombing campaign was dying. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody expected. Edgar Schmude was born in 1899 in Hornbach, Germany. He never attended university. He learned engineering the old-fashioned way at a drafting table in a Brazilian aircraft factory, then later at Fokker in the Netherlands, drawing blueprints for other men's ideas. When he emigrated to America in 1931, he was just another immigrant with a thick accent and a suitcase full of drawings. North American Aviation hired him as a draftsman. Not a chief engineer, not a designer, a man who turned other people's concepts into the technical drawings. But Schmude had something no university could teach. He had an intuitive understanding of how air moved over metal. He could look at a wing cross-section and feel whether the airflow would remain smooth or tumble into turbulence. His colleagues thought it was a party trick. His superiors barely noticed him. He spent a decade in quiet obscurity, refining his understanding, filling notebooks with sketches of airfoils and fuel systems, and cooling ducts that nobody asked for and nobody read. Then, in April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission arrived in California with a desperate request and a blank check. Britain was losing fighters faster than it could build them. The Spitfire factories were being bombed. The Hurricane was aging. They needed a new fighter, and they needed it now. They approached North American Aviation and asked them to build P-40 Warhawks under license. It was a safe, boring request for a safe, boring airplane. James Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, made a decision that would alter history. Instead of building someone else's outdated fighter, he told the British his company could design and build something better. From scratch, in 120 days. The British thought he was insane. 120 days to design a completely new fighter aircraft. Most companies took 2 to 3 years. The standard development timeline for a modern fighter was 40 months. Kindleberger was promising 4. And the man he chose to lead the design was Edgar Schmude, the quiet German immigrant who drew pictures at a desk. Schmude did not sleep for the first 72 hours. He commandeered every drafting table in the factory. He pulled engineers off every other project. The building lights never went off. Coffee pots ran dry and were refilled endlessly. And in those first 3 sleepless days, Schmude made a decision that every other aircraft designer in the world had considered and rejected. He would use a laminar-flow wing. Now, to understand why this was considered crazy, you need to understand how wings work. Air flowing over a conventional wing starts smooth and quickly becomes turbulent, like a river hitting rocks. This turbulence creates drag, which slows the aircraft and burns fuel. A laminar flow wing is shaped so that the air stays smooth over a much larger portion of the surface. In theory, this dramatically reduces drag. In theory, it allows the aircraft to fly faster and farther on less fuel. But in practice, nobody had made it work. The tolerances required were insane. A single rivet head protruding 1/32 of an inch would destroy the laminar flow effect. A coat of paint applied too thickly would ruin it. Every engineer who had tried laminar flow wings on a fighter had failed. The concept worked in wind tunnels. It died on real airplanes. Schmood did not care. He redesigned the manufacturing process from scratch. Every rivet was flush-mounted. Every panel joint was filled and sanded smooth. The wing surface was polished to mirror finish. His engineers told him he was wasting time. His factory foreman told him it would be impossible to produce in quantity. The British liaison officer watched the process and privately cabled London that the Americans were building a beautiful aircraft that would never work. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out of the factory on September 9, 1940. 102 days after Schmood started work, it flew for the first time on October 26th. The test pilot reported that the handling was exceptional, better than any American fighter he had flown. But there was a problem. The Allison V, a 1,710 engine, was adequate at low altitude, but lost power above 15,000 feet. The Mustang Mark I, as the British designated, it was fast and efficient down low, but could not compete with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at the altitudes where the air war over Europe was being fought. The British used it for ground attack and reconnaissance. Good airplane, they said. Wrong engine. It sat in that category for nearly 2 years. A beautiful airframe wasted on a job beneath its potential. Meanwhile, American bombers kept dying over Germany. 60 lost here, 30 lost there. The numbers accumulated like a slow hemorrhage that nobody could stop. Then, on April 30th, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker climbed into a Mustang at the aircraft and armament experimental establishment at Boscombe, down England. Harker was not famous. He was not a general or a politician or a strategist. He was a pilot who tested engines for a living. He flew the Mustang for 45 minutes, landed, and immediately sat down to write a 3-page memorandum that would change the course of the war. This aircraft with a Merlin 61 engine would be the best fighter in the world, Harker wrote. His reasoning was elegant. The Merlin engine had a 2-stage 2-speed supercharger that maintained full power at high altitude. The Mustang airframe had the lowest drag of any fighter in existence thanks to Schmood's laminar-flow wing. Marry the two, and you would have something unprecedented. A fighter that was fast at every altitude, maneuverable enough to dogfight with anything, and so fuel-efficient that its range would be double that of any existing escort fighter. The response from the establishment was lukewarm. The Merlin was needed for Spitfires and Lancasters. There were not enough engines to go around. Modifying an American airframe to accept a British engine would take months of redesign work. And besides, the Americans had their P-47 Thunderbolt. Why did they need another fighter? Harker refused to let it go. He lobbied, argued, wrote more memos, and cornered anyone who would listen. Across the Atlantic, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American military attaché in London, took up the cause with equal fervor. Hitchcock had seen the bomber losses firsthand. He knew that without long-range escort, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse. The first Merlin-powered Mustang, the P-51B, flew on November 30th, 1942. The results were not just good. They were staggering. Maximum speed jumped from 390 to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling soared from 30,000 to 42,000 feet. But the number that changed everything was the fuel consumption figure. 43 gallons per hour at cruise, combined with the internal fuel capacity, and 2 110-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B had a combat range of over 2,000 miles. It could fly from England to Berlin fight for 30 minutes over the target and fly home with fuel to spare. When the first P-51Bs arrived at 8th Air Force bases in England in December 1943, the German High Command did not even notice. They were just another American fighter type, another variant to be identified and catalogued, and eventually shot down.
In the briefing rooms of Luftwaffe fighter units, the intelligence reports on the new Mustang were read with mild interest and considerable amusement. Major Klaus Bretschneider of Jagdgeschwader 300 reportedly laughed out loud when he read the claimed range figures. 5-hour missions, he scoffed. Impossible! The Americans are lying. He was not laughing 3 months later, because in March 1944, the Mustangs came to Berlin, and they did not leave. But the arrival of the Mustang over Germany was only the beginning of the nightmare for the Luftwaffe, because what happened next was something no German strategist had planned for, and no German pilot was prepared to face. The Americans did not just escort their bombers, they hunted. And in Part 2, we will see how a single change in tactics transformed the Mustang from a defensive shield into an offensive weapon that would chase German pilots to the gates of their own airfields, shoot them down in their landing patterns, and systematically destroy the Luftwaffe, not plane by plane, but pilot by pilot. The mathematics of attrition were about to become the mathematics of annihilation. In Part 1, we saw how a quiet German immigrant named Edgar Schmude designed the most fuel-efficient fighter airframe in history, how a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker recognized its potential, and how the marriage of an American airframe to a British Merlin engine created a fighter that could fly from England to Berlin and back. By December 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs arrived in England. German pilots laughed at the claimed range figures. They called it propaganda. They said 5-hour missions were impossible. They stopped laughing in March 1944, when Mustangs appeared over Berlin for the first time and refused to leave. But shooting down German fighters over the capital was one thing. Changing the entire doctrine of aerial warfare was something else entirely. And the man who would do it was about to walk into a room full of generals who wanted him to sit down, shut up, and follow the old rules. Because in the spring of 1944, the Mustang had a problem that had nothing to do with engineering. It had a problem with generals. Here is a number that should make your blood run cold. In the first 3 months of 1944, the 8th Air Force lost over 1,000 heavy bombers, 10,000 men, dead, captured, or missing. Every week brought fresh rows of empty bunks at bases across eastern England. Chaplains ran out of condolence letters. Ground crews stopped learning the names of replacement pilots because they would be gone within 2 weeks. The bombing campaign was bleeding to death. And despite the arrival of the Mustang, the losses were not dropping fast enough. The reason was tactical doctrine. Since the beginning of the escort mission, American fighter pilots had operated under a rigid set of rules, written by men who had never sat in a cockpit at 25,000 feet, with a Messerschmitt on their tail. The rules were simple. Stay with the bombers. Do not pursue enemy fighters beyond visual range of the formation. Do not drop below the bomber altitude. Your job is to protect, not to attack. Return with the bombers. Account for every gallon of fuel. These rules made perfect sense for the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning fighters with limited range that could not afford to waste a single drop of fuel chasing Germans across the sky. But applying these same rules to the P-51 Mustang was like buying a thoroughbred racehorse and using it to pull a milk cart. The Mustang had fuel for 5.5 hours of flight. Under the old doctrine, its pilots were ordered to fly in lazy circles around the bomber formation, burning fuel, doing nothing, watching German fighters assemble just outside engagement range, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the bombers. The Mustang pilots could see the enemy forming up. They had the fuel to go after them, but doctrine said no. Stay close, protect, do not chase. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was the first senior officer to challenge this madness publicly. Zemke was not a politician or a theorist. He was a fighter pilot with 12 aerial victories who had been flying combat over Europe since 1943. He understood the air war at a visceral level, and he understood something that the generals in their London offices did not. Defense does not win air wars. Offense does. In February 1944, Zemke submitted a tactical memorandum to 8 Fighter Command headquarters that read like a declaration of war against his own chain of command. Current escort doctrine surrenders the initiative to the enemy, he wrote. We are allowing German fighters to choose when, where, and how to engage. We are handing them the advantage of concentration while we disperse our forces along a bomber stream stretching 200 miles. This is not escort. This is suicide with extra steps. The memorandum landed on the desk of Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command. Kepner read it twice. Then he called Zemke to London. The meeting that followed has been reconstructed from multiple post-war interviews and memoirs, and it remains one of the most consequential conversations of the air war. Kepner sat behind his desk. Zemke stood at attention. On the wall behind Kepner hung a sign that his predecessor, Brigadier General Frank Hunter, had posted months earlier. It read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Kepner looked at Zemke and asked one question. If I give you permission to turn your fighters loose, can you promise me the bomber losses will drop? Zemke's answer was brutally honest. No, sir. In the short term, they might go up. German fighters that we're currently keeping at arm's length will get through to the bombers. But in 3 months, there won't be enough German fighters left to threaten anybody. Kepner stared at him for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the wall, and personally tore down the sign about bringing the bombers back alive. In its place, he would later hang a new sign that read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." That moment changed the air war over Europe. But Kepner could not make this change alone. He needed the support of one man whose opinion carried more weight than every general in the 8th Fighter Command combined. Lieutenant General James Doolittle had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. Doolittle was already a legend. He had led the famous raid on Tokyo in April 1942, flying B-25 bombers off an aircraft carrier in what was widely considered the most audacious mission of the war. He had a Medal of Honor, a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and a reputation for making decisions that terrified conventional thinkers. He was exactly the kind of commander that the moment required. When Kepner presented him with Zemke's proposal to unleash the Mustangs, Doolittle did not hesitate. He approved it immediately and went further. He issued a directive that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. After escorting the bombers to the target fighter groups were authorized to descend to low altitude and attack targets of opportunity across Germany. Airfield, rail yards, convoys, anything that supported the German war machine. The Mustangs were no longer bodyguards. They were assassins. The first test of the new doctrine came on March 6, 1944. Big Week, the massive series of coordinated bombing raids on German aircraft factories, had just concluded. The 8th Air Force launched its first major daylight raid on Berlin itself. 814 heavy bombers, escorted by 796 fighters, including 243 P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them with everything it had. Over 500 German fighters scrambled from bases across northern Germany. It was the largest aerial battle since the war began. And for the first time, the Mustang pilots fought under the new rules. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group was leading a flight of 4 Mustangs at 28,000 feet when he spotted a formation of approximately 40 Messerschmitt 109S assembling below, preparing for a massed head-on attack against the bomber stream. Under the old doctrine, Gentile would have stayed at altitude, positioned between the enemy and the bombers, and waited. Under the new doctrine, he rolled, inverted, and dove straight into them. His flight hit the German formation like a hammer hitting glass. The carefully organized attack dissolved into chaos. German pilots scattered in every direction, their coordinated assault broken before it could begin. Gentile personally shot down 3 109S in the space of 4 minutes. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, got 2 more. The 40-fighter formation that could have devastated the bomber stream was destroyed as a fighting force without a single German pilot getting within gun range of a B-17. But it was what happened after the initial engagement that truly demonstrated the revolution. In the past, American pilots would have climbed back to altitude and resumed their escort position. Instead, Gentile's flight chased the scattered Germans east. They pursued them for over 60 miles, deep into German airspace, catching them as they tried to reform, shooting them down one by one. Gentile did not break off until he had followed a damaged 109 all the way down to a German airfield and watched it crash on the runway. He still had 2 hours of fuel remaining. The results of the March 6 Berlin raid were devastating for the Luftwaffe. The Germans lost 69 fighters destroyed and another 37 damaged. American bomber losses were 69 as well, a terrible number, but the fighter exchange rate had shifted dramatically. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe lost more fighters defending against a raid than the Americans lost bombers conducting it, and the numbers kept improving. On March 8th, another Berlin raid. 37 bombers lost. 87 German fighters destroyed. March 9th, 11 bombers lost. 53 German fighters destroyed. The new doctrine was not just working. It was creating a mathematical death spiral from which the Luftwaffe could not escape. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 victories, described the effect in a post-war interview. Before March 1944, we chose our battles. We attacked when conditions favored us and withdrew when they did not. After the Americans changed their tactics, we no longer had that luxury. Their fighters came down to find us. They attacked our airfields. They chased us into our landing patterns. The initiative passed completely to the enemy, and we never got it back. The training programs accelerated the collapse. Doolittle authorized a systematic campaign targeting Luftwaffe training bases, a strategy that would have been impossible without the Mustang's range. Fighter groups were assigned specific German airfields and ordered to patrol them. Not occasionally, constantly. Mustangs would arrive over a training base at dawn and circle for 30 minutes, shooting down any aircraft that attempted to take off or land. They would leave, and another flight would arrive an hour later. The German flight schools could not function. Oberfeldwebel Siegfried Bethke, a flight instructor with Jagdflieger 103, described the nightmare in his personal diary. I had 12 students ready for their first formation flight. We had waited 3 days for clear weather. When it finally came, we took off at 0600. By 06084, Mustangs were on us. They shot down 3 of my students before I could even form them up. The boys had 20 hours in fighters. The Americans were veterans. It was not combat. It was murder. The attrition was catastrophic and irreplaceable. In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot had over 400 hours of combat experience. By June, new pilots were arriving at frontline units with less than 100 hours total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone fight a veteran American pilot in a superior aircraft. Every experienced pilot killed over Germany took years of institutional knowledge to his grave. Every replacement arrived less prepared than the one before. General Adolf Galland, the commander of all German fighter forces, pleaded with the High Command for relief. In a meeting with Hermann Göring in April 1944, he laid out the mathematics of destruction in terms even the Reichsmarschall could understand. We are losing pilots faster than we are training them. We are losing experienced leaders who cannot be replaced at any cost. If the current rate continues, we will have no effective fighter force by autumn. Göring's response was to accuse Galland of cowardice and threaten him with court-martial. The Luftwaffe would fight on, Göring declared. German bravery would overcome American technology. But bravery could not overcome arithmetic. By May 1944, Mustangs were flying 60% of all 8th Air Force escort missions. Bomber losses dropped from 377 in January to 148 in May. German fighter losses climbed from 307 to 432 in the same period. The exchange rate that had once favored the Luftwaffe at 3-1 had completely reversed. Mustang pilots were now claiming 6 German aircraft for every loss. The sky over Germany was becoming an American lake. And then, on June 6, 1944, the greatest invasion in military history crossed the English Channel. D-Day. 156,000 Allied soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy. The entire operation depended on one critical assumption: that the Luftwaffe would not interfere, that the skies above the invasion beaches would belong to the Allies. On the morning of June 6, the Allied forces flew 14,000 sorties over Normandy. The Luftwaffe managed less than 100. In the most important 24 hours of the entire war, German air power was virtually absent. Not because they lacked aircraft, not because they lacked pilots willing to die, but because the Mustangs had spent the previous 3 months systematically destroying both. But the story was far from over. Because deep inside the crumbling Reich, German engineers were working on something that would terrify Allied pilots and threaten to undo everything the Mustang had achieved. A weapon so fast that no propeller-driven fighter could catch it. A weapon that flew at 550 miles per hour and carried enough explosives to destroy an entire bomber in a single pass. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. And in Part 3, we will see how the Mustang pilots faced this terrifying new threat, how they developed tactics to fight an enemy they could not outrun, and how the war's most critical technological race came down to a handful of pilots flying piston engines against the dawn of the jet age. The arithmetic of abundance was about to collide with the arithmetic of innovation, and the outcome would determine who controlled the skies over the final battlefields of the Third Reich. In Part 1, a German immigrant draftsman named Edgar Schmude designed a revolutionary airframe with a laminar-flow wing that nobody believed would work. In Part 2, Generals Doolittle and Kepner tore up the old escort doctrine and unleashed the Mustangs as offensive hunters, creating a mathematical death spiral that cost the Luftwaffe thousands of irreplaceable pilots. By June 1944, American Mustangs owned the skies over Europe. D-Day succeeded because German air power had been systematically gutted. The hunters had become the hunted. But deep inside, the Reich German engineers had an answer. A weapon that flew 120 miles per hour, faster than any Mustang. A weapon that could slash through a bomber formation and vanish before any escort pilot could react. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. And in the autumn of 1944, it arrived over the battlefield like a thunderbolt from the future. The arithmetic of abundance was about to collide with the arithmetic of innovation. And for the first time since March, American pilots felt something they had almost forgotten: fear. The first confirmed encounter between a P-51 Mustang and a Me-262 occurred on July 25, 1944, near Stuttgart. Lieutenant Colonel John Murphy of the 359th Fighter Group was escorting B-17S at 26,000 feet when something streaked past his flight at impossible speed. Murphy later described it in his debriefing report. It looked like a regular 109 but with no propeller. It went through our formation so fast I couldn't even get my gun sight on it. By the time I rolled to pursue, it was 3 miles away and accelerating. I have never seen anything move that fast. Within weeks, the reports multiplied. Me-262s were appearing over bomber formations with increasing frequency. Their twin Junkers Jumo jet engines produced nearly 4,000 pounds of thrust, pushing the aircraft to 540 miles per hour in level flight. A Mustang at full war emergency power could manage 440. The speed differential was not just significant. It was insurmountable in a straight-line chase. The psychological impact hit American fighter groups like a shockwave. For 6 months, Mustang pilots had operated with near total impunity. They had chased German piston fighters across the sky, hunted them over their own airfields, shot them down in landing patterns. Now, they were facing something they could not catch, could not outrun, and could barely track with their eyes. Intelligence reports from 8 Fighter Command in September 1944 reveal the anxiety. Pilots report extreme difficulty engaging Me-262 aircraft. Standard pursuit tactics are ineffective. Morale impact is significant. The Luftwaffe High Command saw the 262 as their salvation. General Adolf Galland had been begging for jet fighters since early 1943. He had personally test-flown the prototype and declared it felt like angels were pushing him through the sky.
If Germany could produce enough 262s and get them into the air in sufficient numbers, they could theoretically regain air superiority. The mathematics were seductive. A single Me-262 armed with 4 30mm cannons and 24 R-4M rockets could destroy 3 or 4 heavy bombers in a single pass. A formation of 50 could shatter an entire bombing raid. But the jet had a fatal weakness, and the man who discovered how to exploit it was not a general or an engineer. He was a 23-year-old fighter pilot from Oregon named Lieutenant Chuck Yeager. Yeager had already made ace in a single day on October 12, 1944, shooting down 5 German fighters in one mission. He was aggressive, instinctive, and possessed eyesight so sharp that his squadron mates joked he could read a newspaper at 1,000 yards. On November 6, 1944, Yeager was leading a flight of 4 Mustangs at 8,000 feet near Akmer Airfield when he spotted an Mi-262 below him. The jet was in its landing pattern gear extended flaps, down decelerating to approach speed. Yeager did not hesitate. He rolled over and dove. The 262's weakness was brutally simple. Its Jumo jet engines took nearly 30 seconds to spool from idle to full power. During takeoff and landing, the aircraft was slow vulnerable and unable to accelerate quickly enough to escape a diving piston fighter. Yeager had figured this out, not through intelligence briefings or tactical manuals, but through raw observation and combat instinct. He had watched 262s land at Akmer 3 times in the previous week, memorizing their approach patterns, their speeds, their flight paths. His Mustang dove at 450 miles per hour, closing the distance in seconds. The 262 pilot never saw him coming. Yeager opened fire at 300 yards, his .650 caliber machine guns, sending a stream of armor, piercing incendiary rounds into the jet's left engine nacelle. The engine exploded. The 262 cartwheeled into the ground 400 meters short of the runway. Yeager pulled up, banked hard, and strafed 2 more, 262s parked on the taxiway. He had just proven that the world's most advanced fighter could be killed by the world's most persistent one. You just had to catch it at the right moment. Within days, Yeager's tactics spread across every Mustang group in the 8th Air Force. The doctrine was simple and lethal. Do not chase 262s in level flight. You will lose. Instead, patrol their known airfields. Wait for them to take off or land. Hit them when they are slow. The Mustang's extraordinary range made this possible. Pilots could loiter over German jet bases for 30 to 40 minutes, circling like vultures, waiting for their prey to appear. The Luftwaffe tried to counter this by ringing their jet airfields with massive concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. Akmer Rhein and Brandenburg-Brest became some of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, with over 150 flak guns per base. But the Mustang pilots adapted again. They would approach at treetop level below the effective depression angle of the heavy guns, pop up to attack altitude, only when a 262 was committed to its landing approach, fire their burst, and dive back to the deck before the gunners could track them. It was insanely dangerous. The flak claimed dozens of Mustangs, but the math favored the Americans. They could afford to trade Mustangs for 262s, because North American aviation was building 35 new Mustangs every day, while the German jet factories under constant bombardment were struggling to produce 30 per month. The numbers tell the story. The Luftwaffe took delivery of approximately 1,400 Mi-262s during the entire war. Of those, only around 200 were ever operational at any given time. Fuel shortages grounded many. Mechanical failures plagued the unreliable Jumo engines, which had an average service life of just 25 hours before requiring complete overhaul. Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants meant that even when 262s were available, there was often no fuel to fly them. Against this, the 8th Air Force had over 1,000 Mustangs operational by January 1945. The ratio was 5-to-1, and every 262 that the Mustangs destroyed on the ground or in its landing pattern was one less threat to the bomber formations. Major Heinrich Erler of Jagdgeschwader One of the Luftwaffe's most experienced jet units recorded his frustration in a letter dated February 1945. "We have the fastest fighter in the world, and we cannot use it. The Americans circle our airfields like sharks. We take off into a gauntlet of Mustangs. We land through a gauntlet of Mustangs. Yesterday, Feldwebel Braun was shot down on final approach with his gear down. The day before, Lieutenant Schreiber was destroyed on the runway before he could reach takeoff speed. We are being strangled in our own cradles." But the 262 was not the only crisis facing Mustang pilots in the winter of 1944. A problem that had been building for months finally exploded into a full-blown emergency. The Mustang's Merlin engine, the miracle power plant that had made everything possible, had a terrifying vulnerability. At high altitude, in the extreme cold of the European winter, the engine's coolant system was prone to catastrophic failure. Glycol coolant lines would crack in temperatures below -40 degrees. A single crack meant a coolant leak. A coolant leak meant engine seizure. Engine seizure at 25,000 feet over Germany meant death. In December 1944 alone, 17 Mustangs were lost to engine failures, unrelated to combat damage. 17 pilots either killed or captured because their engines simply stopped working. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, wrapping coolant lines in improvised insulation, sealing joints with compounds never designed for aviation use. It was field engineering at its most desperate, men with wrenches fighting physics to keep their pilots alive. The engineering teams at Rolls-Royce and Packard, which built the Merlin under license in America, developed revised coolant line specifications and new sealing compounds that were rushed to frontline units by January 1945. The failure rate dropped by 80% within a month. The crisis was contained, but it served as a grim reminder that even the best machine in the sky was only as reliable as its weakest component. By March 1945, the air war over Germany had reached its terrible conclusion. The Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Monthly German fighter pilot losses exceeded monthly training output by a factor of 3. New pilots arrived at frontline units with fewer than 50 hours of total flight time. Many had never fired their guns in the air. Some had never practiced aerobatics. They were sent up to face American veterans with 400 hours of combat experience, flying the finest piston engine fighter ever built. The kill ratios became grotesque. In January 1945, Mustangs claimed 161 aerial victories, while losing 27 of their own. In February, the ratio was even more lopsided, 212 to 19. The Mustang groups were no longer fighting an air force. They were conducting an execution. On April 16, 1945, the 357th Fighter Group, based at least in England, launched a mission that would become legendary in the annals of air combat. 72 Mustangs escorted bombers to targets near Prague, deep in what remained of the shrinking Reich. After the bombers turned for home, the Mustangs dropped to low altitude and swept across southern Germany and Czechoslovakia, hitting every target they could find. Airfields, rail yards, vehicle columns, barges on the Danube. By the end of the day, the 357th had claimed 47 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 12 in the air, 31 locomotives, and over 100 vehicles. They lost 3 Mustangs. 3. The group's combat diary recorded the mission with a single understated line: maximum effort, minimum resistance. The broader statistics confirm the totality of the Mustang's dominance. In the final 4 months of the European War, P-51 Mustangs flew over 60,000 sorties. They claimed 1,800 aerial victories. They destroyed over 3,000 aircraft on the ground. They fired over 2 million rounds of ammunition and dropped thousands of bombs on tactical targets across the collapsing Reich. The 8th Air Force's bomber loss rate, which had peaked at nearly 10% per mission in late 1943, fell below 1% by April 1945. The Mustang had not just protected the bombers, it had made the entire strategic air campaign possible. General Carl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, wrote in his final assessment, "The P-51 Mustang was the weapon that won the air war over Europe. Without it,
the daylight bombing campaign would have failed. Without the bombing campaign, the invasion of Normandy could not have succeeded. Without Normandy, the war in Europe would have lasted years longer and cost millions more lives. The chain of consequence begins with one aircraft. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Mustangs flew their last combat missions over Europe that same day, strafing pockets of resistance that had not yet received the ceasefire order. When the guns finally fell silent, the pilots returned to bases that had been their homes for over a year. They parked their fighters, climbed out of their cockpits, and walked into a world that was suddenly impossibly at peace. But the story of the P-51 Mustang does not end with the German surrender. And the story of Edgar Schmood, the quiet draftsman who drew lines on paper and changed the world, has a final chapter that almost nobody knows. A chapter about what happens to the man who builds the weapon that wins the war. A chapter about recognition, denied credit stolen, and a legacy that was nearly erased from history. In Part 4, we will follow the Mustang from Europe to the Pacific, where it faced an entirely different kind of war against an enemy willing to die rather than surrender. We will discover what became of Edgar Schmood after the victory parades ended. And we will learn why the greatest fighter of World War II carries lessons that military planners are still learning today, 80 years later. The arithmetic of war was settled in the skies over Germany. But the arithmetic of legacy was about to become far more complicated. A German immigrant draftsman who never went to college designed a laminar-flow wing that every engineer said was impossible. A Rolls-Royce test pilot wrote a 3-page memo that married that wing to a British engine. 2 American generals tore up the rulebook and unleashed the resulting fighter as an offensive weapon. And young men from Oregon and Texas and Ohio flew that weapon into the heart of Nazi Germany, hunting the Luftwaffe to extinction at 25,000 feet. The P-51 Mustang changed the air war-enabled D-Day, survived the threat of jet fighters, and broke the spine of the most experienced air force in the world. But we left one question unanswered. What happened to the man who drew the lines on paper? What happened to Edgar Schmood after the victory parades ended and the factory lights went dark? Because the story of the Mustang has a final twist that is quieter than the roar of a Merlin engine, but cuts deeper than any 30mm cannon shell. Success, it turns out, does not always remember the hands that built it. When Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, Edgar Schmood was 56 years old. He was still at North American Aviation, still drawing, still designing. The P-51 Mustang had become the most celebrated fighter of the war. Newspapers ran stories about the brave young pilots who flew it. Generals wrote memoirs about the tactics that employed it. Politicians gave speeches about the industrial might that produced it. Almost nobody mentioned the man who designed it. Schmood received no Medal of Freedom, no congressional recognition, no ticker tape parade. He was a German-born immigrant in an era when German names still carried the stench of the enemy. The irony was savage. The man who had done more than perhaps any single individual to destroy the Luftwaffe was quietly overlooked because he had been born in the same country as the pilots his creation was killing. James Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, who had made the bold decision to build a new fighter instead of licensing the P-40, received most of the corporate credit. The test pilots who flew the prototypes became minor celebrities. The Rolls-Royce engineers who built the Merlin were knighted. Schmood went back to his drafting table. He did not complain. Those who knew him said he was not a man built for public acclaim. He was a man built for clean lines and smooth airflow, and the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved elegantly. After the war, he led the design team for the F-86 Sabre, the jet fighter that would dominate the skies over Korea. The Sabre's swept wing design drew directly from principles Schmood had explored in his wartime notebooks. When American pilots achieved a 10-to-1 kill ratio against Soviet-built MiG-15S over the Yalu River, they were flying another Schmood creation. Again, almost nobody outside the aviation industry knew his name. He later worked on the XB-70 Valkyrie, a Mach 3 bomber that represented the pinnacle of Cold War aeronautical ambition. The project was eventually canceled, But the technologies it pioneered fed directly into the next generation of supersonic aircraft. Schmood retired from North American aviation in 1967 after 36 years with the company. He had designed or contributed to some of the most important aircraft in American history. He lived quietly in Southern California until his death on June 1, 1985, at the age of 86. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times was 4 paragraphs long. 4 paragraphs for the man who designed the airplane that won the air war over Europe. 4 paragraphs for the draftsman whose lines on paper saved tens of thousands of bomber crewmen and shortened the war by months, if not years. The aviation community mourned him, but the wider world barely noticed. It was perhaps the most unjust silence of the entire war's aftermath. But the legacy of what Schmood built did not need a parade to endure. It needed only to keep flying. And fly it did. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war ended before the Mustang could fully demonstrate its capabilities in the Pacific theater. But the aircraft's story was far from over. When North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, the first American combat aircraft over the peninsula were P-51 Mustangs, recalled from storage and rushed to the front lines. They flew close air support missions over the frozen ridges of Korea, providing cover for outnumbered ground troops during the desperate retreat from the Choyugu Reservoir. In the first months of the Korean War, before jet fighters arrived in sufficient numbers, Mustangs were the backbone of American air power. They flew over 62,000 sorties in Korea, more than any other American fighter type. The Mustang served with 28 different air forces around the world. Israel flew Mustangs in its 1948 War of Independence. The Dominican Republic kept Mustangs in active service until 1984, nearly 40 years after the type first entered combat. The Indonesian Air Force used them in combat operations into the 1960s. Bolivia, Haiti, Guatemala, the Philippines, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, China, South Korea, and a dozen other nations all operated the P-51 at one point or another. No other fighter of its era came close to this global footprint. The total production figure stands as a monument to American industrial capacity. 15,586 Mustangs
Rolled off the assembly lines at Inglewood and Dallas. At peak production, a new Mustang was completed every 45 minutes. The total cost of the entire Mustang program was approximately $650 million $1944. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $11 billion today.
For comparison, the current F-35 program is projected to cost over $1.7 trillion. The Mustang delivered decisive air superiority for less than 1% of what its modern equivalent costs. But the Mustang's most enduring technical legacy lies not in any specific component, but in a philosophy. Edgar Schmood proved that the best weapon is not always the most powerful or the most technologically advanced. It is the one that balances performance range, reliability, and producibility into a package that can be built in massive quantities and sustained in the field. This philosophy directly influenced the design of every successful American fighter that followed. The F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. The designers of each of these aircraft studied the Mustang's example and drew the same conclusion. You win air wars, not with a handful of perfect machines, but with 1,000 very good ones that can be everywhere at once. The lesson extends far beyond aviation. Every military planner, every corporate strategist, every innovator who has ever faced the choice between perfection and sufficiency owes a debt to the Mustang's example. The Germans had the Me-262. It was faster. It was more advanced. It was arguably a better pure fighting machine. But they could never build enough of them, never fuel enough of them, never train enough pilots to fly them. The Americans had the Mustang. It was not the fastest or the most advanced, but it was very good, extraordinarily efficient, and they built 15,000 of them. Abundance defeated excellence. Logistics defeated technology. Presence defeated performance. This is the lesson that military theorists call the Mustang paradigm.
and it echoes through every conflict since. In Vietnam, the unglamorous A-10 Warthog was designed around the same principles of simplicity, survivability, and sustained presence over the battlefield. In the Gulf War, the coalition's victory owed as much to logistics and sortie rates as it did to stealth and precision. In every modern defense procurement debate, someone eventually invokes the ghost of the P-51 to argue that sometimes good enough in sufficient quantity beats perfect in insufficient numbers. Yeah, consider the parallel to innovation in any field. How many brilliant ideas have died because the institutions they threatened refused to listen? How many Edgar Schmoods have been ignored because they did not have the right credentials, the right accent, the right connections? The Mustang almost never happened. North American aviation was asked to build someone else's obsolete fighter. If Kindleberger had said yes, if Schmood had never been given the chance, if Harker had never written his memo, if Doolittle had never torn up the old doctrine, the air war over Europe would have ground on for years longer. The bombing campaign might have collapsed entirely. D-Day might have been postponed or failed. The war might have ended with atomic bombs falling on German cities instead of Japanese ones. History balanced on the edge of a drafting pencil held by a man nobody thought was important. And there is one final detail that most histories of the Mustang overlook entirely. In 1979, a retired North American aviation engineer named Raymond Rice gave an interview to an aviation magazine in which he revealed something extraordinary. During the original 120-day design sprint in 1940, Schmood had sketched not one but 3 wing designs for the NA-73X. The first was a conventional wing similar to the Spitfires. The second was a moderate improvement, using a slightly modified airfoil. The third was the radical laminar-flow wing that would change everything. Schmood showed all 3 designs to Kindleberger and recommended the third option, the one every aerodynamicist said would never work in practice. Kindleberger asked him how confident he was. Schmood reportedly thought for a long time before answering. 70%, he said. Kindleberger stared at him. 70%. You want me to bet the company's reputation on 70%? Schmood nodded. 70% is enough when the other 30% only means we have the second best fighter in the world instead of the best. Kindleberger approved the laminar flow wing that afternoon. A 70% bet by a draftsman and a company president who trusted him. That is what changed the war. Not certainty, not genius, not unlimited resources. A 70% chance taken by men who understood that in times of desperation, good odds are a luxury, and the courage to act on imperfect information is the rarest resource of all. Today, over 300 P-51 Mustangs still exist worldwide. Approximately 150 are still airworthy. They appear at air shows across America every summer, their Merlin engines filling the sky with that unmistakable sound. A deep harmonic howl that veterans say they can feel in their chests before they hear it with their ears. When a Mustang passes overhead at 500 feet, people stop talking. Children look up. Old men who remember the war close their eyes and stand very still. At the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, a P-51D named Will It Run hangs from the ceiling alongside the Wright Flyer and the Spirit of St. Louis. It is displayed without fanfare, without elaborate explanation. Just a silver airplane with a 4-bladed propeller and the clean, beautiful lines that Edgar Schmood drew on paper 85 years ago. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. They are heading for the space shuttle or the Apollo capsule. They do not know that the quiet silver fighter above their heads did more to decide the outcome of the 20th century's greatest conflict than almost any other single weapon. From a furniture factory in California to the skies over Berlin, from a draftsman's pencil to 15,586 aircraft that flew 213,000 sorties and claimed nearly 5,000 aerial victories. From a man nobody noticed to a machine that everybody feared. Edgar Schmood proved that the most dangerous weapon in warfare is not the biggest bomb or the fastest plane. It is a good idea in the hands of someone stubborn enough to build it, brave enough to test it, and humble enough to let others take the credit. The P-51 Mustang saved an estimated 100,000 Allied lives by making the strategic bombing campaign survivable and enabling the invasion of Normandy.
It destroyed the Luftwaffe, not through any single battle, but through the relentless mathematics of presence and attrition. And it did all of this because a quiet man who drew lines for a living looked at an airplane and saw not what it was, but what it could be. If you know another story like this, a forgotten innovator, a rejected idea that changed everything, an underdog who rewrote the rules, share it in the comments. Because World War II was full of moments where one person's crazy idea saved thousands of lives. And these stories deserve to be told. The next time you hear someone laugh at an idea they call impossible, remember Edgar Schmood. Remember the laminar-flow wing that could not work. Remember the 5-hour mission that could not be flown. Remember the German pilots who laughed at the Mustang until it followed them home, circled their airfields and waited for them to land. Then, remember this. The distance between ridiculous and revolutionary is often nothing more than one person who refuses to stop drawing.